Hello everyone, I'm up here in the Panhandle in the high plains of the upper Texas Panhandle. This is a part of the state that even a lot of people who live in Texas have never been to. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one is right now we are between Bubbas and Dalhart. That's about a 7-hour drive from Dallas. This part of the state is far from all the populated cities other than Amarillo. It's not really close to anything people want to do. There aren't a lot of tourist attractions up here in this part of the state. The only tourist attractions that I can think of are related to the fact that Route 66 goes through Amarillo. Route 66, which starts in Chicago and ends in the Santa Monica Pier. It passes through Amarillo. So you've got the old 1950s quiche Texas steak ranch, Big Texan Steak Ranch. You've also got the Cadillac Ranch. But other than that, there's not a lot to draw folks from other parts of the state up here. If you don't work up here, you're not related to somebody up here, there's really no reason to come up here unless you're doing what I'm doing right now, which is passing through to somewhere else. Now, if you look around, it is flat, flat, flat. This is the lower part of the United States Great Plains, the high plains. And it is flat like this, starting here in the Texas Panhandle and going all the way up into Canada. There are really not any trees around here. In fact, the only trees that you're going to see are trees that folks have planted as windbreaks for houses. The reason why they have those windbreaks is because there is nothing to stop that cold Canadian Arctic wind in the winter. It comes howling down from Canada, and when it barrels down the plains, it keeps right on going past here. There is nothing to stop it. And I am told it is cold up here in the wintertime. There's a lot of agriculture up here, not because of the rainfall, but because it's under on top of one of the richest aquifers in the United States. And they grow a lot of corn, sorghum, off center pivots. If you fly over here in an airplane or look at this place from Google Earth, there are thousands and thousands of circles that the center pivots make. And the aquifer water underneath where we're at right now is water that was from the last ice age. So if you come to this part of the state and you stop at a roadside stand and buy some corn from some farmer that was grown here, the moisture in that corn where you're eating is water from the last ice age. And the folks up here are generally farmers. I think I've read in the Texas Hunting Guide that they have a deer season up here. I don't know where the deer would hide, and maybe you see something that I don't. But there are a lot of pheasants up here. A lot of people come up here and hunt pheasants. This is really the only part of the state where you've got good pheasant hunting. And in the wintertime, it underlies a major waterfowl flyway. So there's a lot of waterfowl hunting up here as well. Industry is primarily limited to agriculture and agricultural support, with a couple of exceptions I'll talk about here in a second. And a lot of people don't realize how big Texas is. Past Dalhart is a town called Texline. It's on the upper northwest side of the Texas Panhandle. According to Google Earth, if you drive from Texline down to South Padre Island, it's about 940 miles. But if you drive from Texline to the Canadian border, it's only 1,000 miles, so it's almost halfway drive. This is also the part of the United States where when you read about herds of buffalo that were millions or tens of millions large, this is the terrain they were crossing. If you can look around and imagine as far as the eye can see, nothing but buffalo in all directions, and it takes a week or more to pass. This is part of the buffalo migration route as well. Now, other than agriculture up here, there are a couple of kind of industries that just don't fit in that you wouldn't normally think would be up here. And the first is the United States' only helium reserve plant is up here. In fact, I passed it earlier before I came down this road. And I couldn't get very excited about helium, but just looking for things to tell you about in this part of the state, apparently it's a really big deal. Helium is hard to get. The atoms are so light that once they release into the atmosphere, they go straight up into space, never to come back. So if you had a helium-filled birthday balloon, you let it up in the sky, the helium that was in that balloon is out in space right now. And helium is used in medical devices, and it's used in defense technology and some other stuff in superconducting. But you can't really pull it out of the air. The helium that comes from a special kind of petroleum that's found in this part of the country. And the United States was hoarding it because helium is not a common resource across the globe. And because this is America, one of the things that you may not know about is corporations that use helium got together and got Congress to pass a law requiring the United States to sell its helium reserve to these corporations. And of course, they had to sell it below market rates. They weren't allowed to charge market rates. But the fact that they've sold so much helium to folks who use helium in their business means the United States is actually running short of helium, and it could cause problems in the future. Helium shortages right now are causing Party City to have problems in their financial sheet. I think they may be bankrupt now. They're not bankrupt solely because of their inability to get helium, but that is a contributing factor. But the big elephant in the room in this part of the state, so to speak, is the Pantex plant, which is just outside of Amarillo. The Pantex plant is a plant that deals in nuclear weapons. It's something that you wouldn't really think of. It's up in an isolated area. Not as isolated as Los Alamos, obviously. But the Pantex nuclear plant or bomb plant, or I'm not sure exactly what it's called, is what's going to cause me to tell some stories to last the rest of this video. Just kick back, take a look at the scenery, and I've got some stories about nuclear bombs that I've come across in my lifetime that you may or may not find interesting. Now, in the early 90s, I was talking to somebody who worked at a nuclear facility. And this is the early 90s. This was after the Cold War. And I'm a child of the 80s. I remember the marches, the anti-nuclear marches from the 80s. I remember all the marchers going crazy about Reagan, saying he was going to get us all killed. And when the Cold War was won, and it came as a surprise to everybody, several years later I was talking to this guy, and I asked him, what does he do now? Because I knew he worked in a facility that dealt with nuclear bombs, and the Cold War was over. So I said, what does a peacetime facility where you work do right now? And he says, well, we work on nuclear weapons. And I said, well, doesn't the world have enough nuclear weapons? I mean, I watched The Day After. I used to read the newspapers about how there was enough nukes to kill every person 10,000 times over on the planet. So I said, doesn't the world have enough nukes? And he said, well, we're not really working on that as much as we are putting a lot of effort into making sure that they go off when we want them to go off and that they don't go off when we don't want them to go off. And I looked at him because it had never dawned on me that might be an issue, that nukes might go off when you don't want them to. And I gave him a quizzical look, and I was like, well, that's interesting. Do tell more. Because I wanted to hear more about that, and I guess he realized that I was just a little bit too interested in what he had just said, and he shut the conversation down and went another direction. But this whole concept of nukes that might go off when you don't want them to are things that I've thought about off and on through the years. Just outside of Albuquerque, they've hollowed out a mountain where they store a bunch of nuclear bombs, so if those ever go off, Albuquerque's gone. Years later, I talked to a guy who was involved on the periphery of the Pantex plant. As far as I know, he wasn't necessarily working there, but he was definitely in the first orbit outside. And I was telling him this story about this guy who had told me that about, they were worried about nuclear bombs, or at least they were trying to make sure the bombs don't go off when you don't want them to. And he just kind of nodded, and he said, he talks in his interactions with the Pantex folks, and you would think that a nuclear warhead is like a Model T that comes off the assembly line, that the engine is here, and the starter's here, and the battery's here. But he said a lot of the nuclear weapons, especially a lot of the earlier nuclear weapons, they weren't really built the same way. There were a lot of idiosyncrasies from one bomb to the next, even if they were the same model. And apparently what Pantex does now is they break these weapons apart and they service them. Apparently nukes have to be serviced periodically, just like a motorcycle or a boat or anything else. So occasionally they break these nukes open, and he was saying that sometimes they get inside these nukes and they're not exactly what they expect to find. And over the years, they've come up with, I guess, the equivalent of a 3-ring binder that kind of notes on the various idiosyncrasies of different bombs as they come through in different ways to safely disassemble them and service them and I don't know how you service a nuke, but apparently they're not all the same. Even if you think that on something like that, perhaps it should be. Now, I used to work with a guy who was in the Air Force, and he told me in the 70s, and of all the stories I'm going to tell, this is one that is most likely not to be true because this guy was prone to telling tall tales. But I'll relay the story to you like he told us. That essentially he was at Carswell Air Force Base on the west side of Fort Worth in the 70s, and they had some kind of aircraft or some kind of nuclear something that came into that Air Force Base. And apparently on some nuclear bombs you can drop and it'll detonate on impact, or it will detonate at a certain altitude. But some nuclear weapons actually have a timer attached to it. And so they were doing something with this weapon at Carswell, and this timer on when this bomb was supposed to, or detonate this bomb, which wasn't supposed to be going off, all of a sudden started counting down. And when I kind of looked at him, he said there's actually not that big a crisis when that happens, because there's a book that you go to, a procedure book. If something like this happens, you get the clock that starts timing down. I guess they have the equivalent of a 3-ring binder with a bunch of steps that you go through in steps to stop this clock and stop this bomb from going off. So they started going through these steps in this 3-ring binder, and it was not shutting down this nuclear countdown. And so they went through it several times. They called a supervisor over. They went through it. They could not get this clock to shut down. And it got to the point, like on the movies, where you were getting to the point where you have to cut the red wire or the green wire to stop this. And eventually they cut the right wire, but according to him, they had to make a report to the Pentagon, and within a couple of hours there were private jets full of military generals coming from Colorado and from the Pentagon down there to investigate what happened. Speaking of nuclear boo-boos, the craziest story I ever saw when dealing with nukes and almost accidental explosions. There was a guy working on a missile in a missile silo just outside of somewhere in Arkansas, I think Little Rock. And he was working, and he had a socket that was about the size of his fist, and he was doing something on this nuclear missile, and it slipped out of his hand. And he talks about how he watched this socket fall down, bounce, and go into the side of the missile and cause a leak in the side of the missile when it hit it. Now, apparently this missile wasn't that strong. It was the weight or the force of the rocket fuel that actually held it up. So when it started leaking, rocket fuel isn't like normal fuel that uses a spark plug. It's just two chemicals that as soon as they touch, it ignites. And so he knew as soon as there was a leak that the missile was going to explode. There's nothing anybody could do about it. It was like that movie Titanic, where after they hit the iceberg, where the engineer says this ship will sink, it's a mathematical certainty. So it is a show talking about the folks who were there and this craziness that happened with knowing that this nuclear missile is going to explode. And they have safety mechanisms that if it's not armed, it's not supposed to go off. But when you have a fire and it burns insulation away from the wires, the safety mechanisms could be compromised because you don't know how the electricity is going to flow once the insulation is stripped off the wires. So the chances of the nuclear explosion taking out Little Rock were low, but they weren't zero. If you got about an hour and a half, you should take some time and watch it. It is a crazy, crazy story told by first-hand witnesses. And if you were ever inclined to believe the government when they tell you there's nothing to worry about, don't worry about anything, after this movie you may not, because the government was less than forthcoming about what was happening. In fact, one of the guys who worked for the federal government got a phone call in Little Rock basically saying that we've got this nuke on fire, it's going to explode and it may go off, we don't know, and you need to do something. So he walked outside and saw all the kids riding on bicycles, and he basically was like, well, what do you do? Because I got about 10 minutes, and that may not be enough time. That show is on a PBS series called American Experience. It's called Command and Control or Command and Conquer. I'm not sure. If you Google it, you should be able to find it. In fact, I think I'll see if I can't put the link for it in the description. It's about an hour and a half. If you got time to kill watching motorcycle videos like this, and you got a little bit longer, this is definitely worth watching. It is a crazy 100% true story told by the eyewitnesses of how an American city almost turned into radioactive glass, allegedly. All right, if you're with me this far, I appreciate you sticking with me. I'm continuing my project, running across all different parts of Texas. And then perhaps you've taken some time, you've seen a part of Texas that you haven't been to yet, or will never get to. Either way, I appreciate you letting me be your two-wheel tour guide to a part of the state that not even a lot of folks that live here in Texas ever come up and see.